Clemens, thank you so much for joining us. So my first question to you is to ask you a little bit about your background and your research interests, how you came to do the kind of research that you're interested in, and a little bit about your research trajectory.
Yeah, that's, well, thanks for having me, Omar. And yeah, generally my contemporary research project is really what I would summarize as the geopolitical ecology of the Middle East. So that is to say, I want to introduce an element of geopolitics into this tradition of political ecology, which looks at, broadly speaking, the social relations behind the circulation, the extraction, and the use of resources. So, and obviously in the Middle East in particular, this is really a big sort of long-standing problem. The idea of, environmental Orientalism, the idea of this being not a fertile land, sort of ripe for colonization because the natives are incapable of it. So you have a lot of like, environmental Orientalism, environmentalist racism, and you have, of course, the other element in that, the problematic understanding of resource curse, i.e. the idea that the resource richness of the Middle East sort of explains its various conflicts. And this has come in the latest iteration as the notion of a climate conflict or climate war. So very problematically, there are these big arguments about, obviously, the Darfur conflict. That was the first one that was labeled a climate conflict. And then there are now a lot of people even talking about the Syrian civil war being a result of the various droughts that happened before, which did happen before. But of course, this is, again, in a way, an essentialist argument. So this is in a way where I'm now. But now I'm sort of give you a little bit of a background of how I came to that. And this was a sort of longer trajectory. Because when I started my research career, I worked more on what we call like the historical sociology of international relations. So that is to say, I looked at and I particularly criticized the idea or what I call the fallacy of modernity in the Middle East. That is to say that only once we have the creation of so-called modern nation states, we have some semblance of modernity, which then replaced a sort of an outdated Ottoman Empire. And my point was clearly that the Ottoman Empire wasn't backward. It was almost modernizing too rapidly and too harshly, and sort of introducing, yes, modern statecraft, if you like, bounded territories, centralized taxation, a standing army. And so I looked at, in a way, this process of Ottoman disintegration and tried to denaturalize it and tried to say, well, it was really only on the sort of eve of 1914 and obviously with the result of 1918 that it was replaced by various nation states. And I looked a little bit more in detail at Greece and obviously Turkey in the way in which local agents interplayed, obviously with great power politics, but I would never want to reduce, or I find it very problematic to reduce the process of Ottoman disintegration and then subsequent formation of the so-called modern Middle East as simply an imperial process, because obviously that sort of neglects or denies the role of local agents, which the study of which then requires, on the one hand, really detailed social history, but then the reward of it is that you really understand the social forces that are behind it. Now, and now I'm sort of turning this much more or I'm focusing much more into the question how in this process of historical transformation of modern nation state creation, we see a sort of appropriation of resources. And so I did that to avoid what I call, or many people call, and problematic, especially in the Middle East, this methodological nationalism. I look at more the sort of alternative spaces. So I'll look at like the Eastern Mediterranean as a space. I'll look at the Nile Valley as a geopolitical space, and I'll look at the Tigris and Euphrates valleys as a space where you have obviously an integrated resource and an integrated landscape and an integrated nature, but then which is artificially divided between various administrations. And I want to sort of enrich that tradition of political ecology, which looks at very much from below, which is very much historicist, which very much looks at political economy. So they do look at things like the relationship between, let's say, financial capitalism, financial accumulation, and the extraction of resources. But what they fail to sort of, what they underestimate, I think, is the nature of the sort of competitive and nation-based or state-based appropriation of resources. It's not like capital comes from outer space. There's always a mediator, and that mediator is or are the various nation states, all of whom to some extent have a competitive element in their sort of developmentalist agendas, which then also actually goes back to obviously the sort of post-colonial origins. So yeah, that's pretty much where I came from and sort of where I see myself now.
Thanks so much. And part of the reason, we were very happy for you to join the multipolarity group is because of this varied interest that actually is sort of both contemporary, but also has this historical perspective. But can you talk to us a little bit more now that you're part of the multipolarity working group in security and context, a little bit of some of your interests for joining the working group? What are the kind of themes that you think are important to study from this broad lens or broad topic of multipolarity? Which will then lead me to ask you a little bit about your specific research project that you have, which is related to this theme.
Yeah. So to my mind, the sort of appropriation takes place on a sort of nation-based level, and I spent some time of my career also being an assistant professor in Ankara in Turkey. And of course, we have a huge discourse or a huge, like geopolitical conflict, even though I'm not sure if that's even the right word for it. For example, about the gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. And all of this is tied back to this idea of Turkey as a rising power, as an emerging power, as an emerging market. And so certainly the idea of, first of all, this regional power being an emerging power, then other regional powers, notably, I would say Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, also having the same sort of being on the same trajectory on sort of a growth-based developmentalist model that requires huge resource extraction and transformation and circulation of resources, and in that I would actually include renewables. Also, I would not reduce, let's say, energy geopolitics to simply hydrocarbons, even though that's something that's very common, a common thing to do in the Middle East. But the contemporary global market situation, both and also individual states and also the projects, you see a lot of sort of zero carbon cities proposed, for example, in the Gulf states. You see a lot of solar investment, for example, Chinese solar investment in Egypt, and of course Turkey is developing all energy sources at rapid pace almost. So what I then therefore found interesting about the multipolarity, the point of multipolarity, is it was there, right? It was like glaringly obvious that, again, it wasn't something that the United States or Europe had any sort of control over. Yes, there is still, I think we have to sort of dissect various aspects of, let's say, the performance of power and the projection of power. And yes, of course, the US still has one of the biggest global spread of their military. But especially when you look at, for example, the projection of Turkish power, especially in Syria, but also all the way to Libya, and the sort of high-tech drone technology they're using, you certainly see that this idea of Turkey being, for example, an emerging market, so again, like being sort of a growth market with growth figures akin to China, as well as a geopolitical growth, as well as having a sort of growing its geopolitical footprint, then yeah, you'd see that that it certainly comes up as a player. But also because when I was spending time in Turkey, I had a lot of connections with people who worked on Turkey-China relations, and it's really when you work in Western academia, you don't see that. like the questions are always the same, especially with Turkey. It's like, oh, is it going to become an EU member? And in the US, of course, it's always the same. Like, okay, what are our relations with Turkey? What is Congress saying, and so on and so forth. But actually, I mean, if you look at Chinese investment, you have Chinese investment, for example, and you have Russian, obviously, geopolitical power projection in the Middle East. So yeah, I mean, if you look, for example, a thing like the Astana process between Iran, Russia, and Turkey, they're a much more powerful actor in Syria right now than any Western actor, like than the United States, or let alone the EU, which is hardly visible there. So for me, it was very obvious that the way in thing, I mean, generally the way in which world politics is going is certainly already, I mean, it's already past the point of no return, going towards a complex multipolarity. And so I was really happy to find the group forming, and I'm also really happy that actually there are a couple of Chinese members, as like it is really a global group, and people are also working on resources, or working on like Rob Vitalis, like working on this really critical notion of ecology, and really problematizing the sort of naturalization of hydrocarbon economy, and that's really something I'm keen on exploring. So it's on the one hand the question of ecology, of energy politics, and the other thing I think that I'm keen on exploring is the role of finance in it. But always with this the back of my mind, or back of everyone's mind, in fact, I think in the group, that really this is also a geopolitical process, and that's why I like this emphasis on this multipolarity, because it's not, finance is important, it's global, and I would consider myself to some extent a political economist, but of course we have to sort of we can't just talk about, I mean, have friends that do great work, but we can't just focus on US, Canada, and the UK, and the way in which finance capitalism works there. The financial expansion meant that you have capital going everywhere and needing to grow, and you see that on the ground. You see that going up in the form of skyscrapers in cities like Beirut or Istanbul, or all the way down to, again, these somewhat utopian on the one hand, but my mind, I'm assuming at some point that potentially might become dystopian, these zero carbon cities on the Gulf.
Absolutely. And actually, that leads me to my final question, which is this really fascinating and ongoing research that you have planned. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a sneak preview, so to speak, which is that we've all known about the geopolitics of hydrocarbons and the debates over oil and conflict, but you're pointing towards the geopolitics of decarbonization. And will the green future herald an era of peace and coexistence, or what is actually happening? Tell us a little bit about what you refer to as the geopolitics of decarbonization.
Yeah. So I will ignore the title a little bit and start with the financial aspect, and because this also has hit the news lately. Surprise, surprise! A lot of the growth. I mean, if you have money on the side, my sort of amateur investment advice is put it into green capital, because the profit margins are huge. Not because they produce like amazing amounts. I mean, it's all speculative and sort of virtual, whatever, accumulation in any case. But we see this is really literally where the money is going. This is why the Gulf economies and also Russia are struggling with the oil price. Now it's stabilized, but obviously it plummeted literally below zero basically at some point. And the reason is, we have, of course, and again, the historical part of this is that we, in the 70s, with the financialization of everything, we have a financialization of oil. So all of these debates, I mean, these very crude debates about, I mean, these Malthusian debates about, there being an oil scarcity or versus there being an oil glut. I mean, the point is besides the point. The main part of energy markets are, again, financialized, i.e. they are part, of a speculative sort of casino capitalism. And the same actually is happening, or has happened already, with, of course, renewables. Now I'm coming to the geopolitical aspect of it. which is that renewables, unlike oil is actually quite mobile. Oil, you can, like you have, of course, yeah, you have oil whales, but and sometimes there is an issue with displacing people. There was now in the US, there was this issue with Biden now canceled with the pipeline in North Dakota going through native land. But the key is renewables obviously sound great. Zero carbon sounds great. We need to reduce carbon emissions to survive as a species almost. But renewables are huge in sort of land uptake. So especially when you look at some solar investments in Egypt, but actually Morocco is a sort of the global leader in solar. You see there's, there's on the one hand, again, it comes back to this Orientalist notion of an empty desert. Okay, we can just put solar panels in it. Oh, nobody's there. Nobody's going to use, anything, and this is one thing, and the other thing is that solar, any solar technology actually requires a lot of water for cleaning of. I mean, either you have parabolic mirrors, they need cleaning, and they need labor force as well. So you can't actually put it right anywhere. You have to have a water source of some sort, and the same goes for photovoltaic plants. They too require maintenance and cleaning and water, therefore. So there is, of course, like everything else, there is a sort of nexus between various resources. And the same goes for wind, obviously. Wind is really interesting, I think, in the region. I think you have a lot of wind investment in Greece, again, like driven by international financial investors. Now Turkey is next online, even though the Turkish government has for a long time, for their own political reasons, have put a lot of money in, on the one hand, coal, because a lot of the coal mine owners are close to the government, and therefore, but now again, the markets took the decision sort of out of their hands, and there's nobody wants to invest in coal anymore. They have a hard time struggling to find money, and so renewables are now again much more market driven than sort of policy driven. Now, yeah, there's going to be massive expansion of onshore wind. I haven't heard much about offshore wind in the Mediterranean, but that will definitely also be an interesting thing to look out for. And then, of course, we are back to sort of this idea. Okay, so there is, given there's a spatial element and there's a resource sort of nexus element, and there's a labor element, and of course, to some extent, there is a sort of what I would call interspecies element, right? I mean, there is no, there may be Bedouins roaming the desert, but there's also simple, there's wildlife too that may be affected by wind turbines. So some of the Greek islanders report a lot of like birds, obviously dropping dead next to these windmills and so on. So there is, in a way, from a political ecology perspective, but also from a, again, geopolitical perspective, there is a lot of questions to be asked about how, let's say, this impact of an otherwise desirable decarbonization then will actually occur. And the question then to me is like, okay, well, on the one hand is, okay, what are the decarbonization conflicts, right? So we assume, okay, fossil fuels are conflict ridden. Well, and again, they're green, as you mentioned, and green and renewables are whatever, peaceful and happy. and obviously there's a really false dichotomy there, because again, like if I look at it from a purely sort of spatial dimension, then I know that renewables are the ones taking up much more land than fossils would. And in fact, actually, I think on average, probably have to sort of verify that with data, but I assume it would also take up more labor, which of course is always an interesting argument, which is about, obviously, this is providing growth and jobs. If you look at, for example, the Moroccan solar plan, it's very proud of the sort of, it comes wrapped up with a sort of local rural development projects. But then actually they figured out once they started these huge solar farms with a lot of funding from, for example, European public banks. So the German KfW, which is basically a state bank, but also the European Bank for Reconstruction of Development, and then the African and Arab equivalents too. They all put money into this. So it's not just speculative, it's also policy-driven, the investments. But they found out that the idea of rural development really failed because people, okay, what do you want me to do? Like clean the clean the mirrors. You can do that. Robots can do that. You don't. There's an optimization process. And in fact, what happened was that a lot of pomegranate farmers in the sort of in the south of the reservoirs that's feeding the solar farm had reduced harvests, and so far from rural development, you had your first very decarbonization conflict, and that's only the one between humans and humans. So that doesn't even include the one between wildlife and other forms of ecology and the sort of, again, this human appropriation of resources. So my hunch is, of course, or my, let's say, hypothesis is that again, we see this mediated process, and that's again this perspective of a geopolitical ecology. We see this mediated process of resource appropriation through a sort of global financialized capitalism, but mediated by local powers competitive for even renewables. I mean, the classic example is transboundary rivers, and then we have the big question about what happens to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and what Sudan actually just switched camps. It was much more pro-Ethiopian, and now it's actually much more pro-Egypt, because they are now worried, and the Ethiopians had always promised that they take care of everyone's needs. But yeah, the final design is in question now, or they're finishing it very rapidly, again for highly political reasons. Namely that now there's a civil war in Ethiopia, and projecting power through a dam project always helps. So now the current Prime Minister, Abiy, who had received the Peace Nobel Prize previously, is now overlooking a pretty genocidal civil war in the Tigray region with the help of its former enemies. Interestingly, the Eritrean troops, Emirati troops, are all helping the effort, so to speak. It has led to actual tensions with Sudan, because Sudan is hosting most of the refugees now, and they are telling the story of what's happening. And so Abiy is then obviously quite keen on looking elsewhere and building a dam and making everyone sort of happy that way, and make everyone look away from what's happening in Tigray. And that then in turn will have obviously effects on Sudan and Egypt. But of course the Nile is another example, just like Euphrates and Tigris, of a very sort of historic resource where you have very historic processes of these sort of resource appropriation, competition, the cotton farms. The first kind of large scale irrigation schemes really happening in Sudan during the British colonial times. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to sort of giving you a bit more of a concise and narrowed down and sort of hopefully more spicy version of that. But that's really what I'm like keenly looking at the moment.
Thank you so much. And actually, that last topic was perfect topic to end on, because Security in Context is having an upcoming event on March 3rd on mega dams in East Africa, from the developmental and geopolitical and human insecurity impact on them. So that's a perfect segue for our upcoming event. Thank you so much for this brief but yet very rich overview of your work and your ongoing projects. We hope this is going to be the start of many conversations with you, either one-on-one or with the broader working group, which we're going to be presenting our work collectively. So it's great to have you, Clemens, and thanks so much for your time. Yeah,
my pleasure, Omar. And I'm very happy to be on board, and I'm very grateful actually to be part of this really interesting and engaging group. And I hope at some point we'll be able to meet in person somewhere.
Yes, that would be nice. That would be nice. Thanks.
Yeah.